Socrates on trial. When Athens silenced the philosopher who challenged the world. Imagine a world where asking questions could get you killed, where challenging people to think deeper, to examine their beliefs, to admit their ignorance was considered a crime punishable by death. You might think this sounds like some dystopian nightmare, but this was Athens in 399 BC. And the man they put on trial wasn't a criminal or a tyrant. He was a 70-year-old philosopher whose only weapon was a question, how do you know what you think you know? His name was Socrates, and his trial would become one of the most consequential legal proceedings in human history. Not because of what he was accused of, but because of what his death revealed about the eternal conflict between truth and power, between comfortable lies and uncomfortable questions. Today we're going to witness how Athens, the birthplace of democracy, chose to silence the very mind that would make them immortal. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. Socrates saw his death coming. He could have escaped. He could have fled. He could have kept quiet. Instead, he chose to die for a principle that would outlive every single person who condemned him. The question is, would you have made the same choice? The morning sun cast long shadows across the Athenian agora as an old man shuffled through the marketplace, his bare feet moving with surprising purpose across the worn stones. To the casual observer, Socrates looked like any other elderly Athenian citizen, short, balding, with a paunch that spoke of a life well lived and a face that his friends generously described as distinctive, but appearances deceived. This unremarkable-looking man was about to become the most dangerous person in Athens, not because he carried weapons, not because he plotted revolutions, but because he carried something far more threatening to those in power, questions that had no comfortable answers. For decades, Socrates had made it his mission to expose the ignorance that masqueraded as wisdom throughout Athenian society. Politicians who couldn't define justice, priests who couldn't explain piety, poets who couldn't articulate beauty, military leaders who couldn't describe courage. One by one, through patient questioning, Socrates revealed that those who claimed to know the most actually knew the least. His method was deceptively simple. He would approach respected figures in Athenian society with genuine curiosity. "I've heard you're wise," he would say. "Could you teach me about virtue?" Then came the questions. Not accusations, not arguments, just questions. "What is courage? Can you give me an example?" "But doesn't that example contradict what you just said? If you can't define it, how do you know when you see it?" What happened next was always the same. These supposedly wise men would find themselves trapped in contradictions of their own making, unable to defend beliefs they had never truly examined. They would storm away, humiliated and angry, while Socrates would turn to whoever was watching and say, with genuine humility, "Well, at least I know that I don't know." This wasn't academic philosophy conducted in ivory towers. This was public theater performed in the heart of Athens, with audiences that grew larger each day. Young men began following Socrates around, delighting in watching their elders stumble over their own certainties. They learned not just to question authority, but to question the assumptions that authority was built upon. The oracle at Delphi had once declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. He spent years trying to disprove this pronouncement, seeking out the wisest men in Athens, only to discover that their wisdom was illusory. The oracle, he finally realized, was right, not because he possessed great knowledge, but because he alone acknowledged his ignorance. But here's what Socrates understood that others missed. Acknowledging ignorance isn't the end of wisdom. It's the beginning. When you admit you don't know something, you become capable of learning it. When you cling to false certainty, you remain forever ignorant. This insight terrified Athens' elite. If the foundations of their authority could be questioned, what else might crumble? If young people stopped accepting traditional answers, who would control them? If citizens began thinking for themselves, who would tell them what to think? As Athens struggled to rebuild itself after the devastating Peloponnesian War, many citizens yearned for stability, for certainty, for leaders who projected confidence rather than doubt. The last thing they wanted was an old man wandering around, making everyone question everything. The city that had once celebrated intellectual freedom now found that freedom inconvenient. Democracy, it turned out, was easier to manage when citizens didn't ask too many questions. And Socrates, with his relentless pursuit of truth over comfort, was becoming increasingly seen as a threat to social order. What his enemies didn't yet understand was that Socrates had already planted seeds that would grow long after he was gone. He had taught an entire generation that the unexamined life is not worth living, that questioning everything isn't rebellion, it's responsibility. That wisdom begins with admitting ignorance. But first, they would try to silence him, and in doing so, they would ensure that his voice would echo through history forever. The year 3999 BC began like any other in Athens, but beneath the surface of daily life, powerful forces were aligning against the city's most famous gadfly. Three men, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, had decided that Socrates had asked his last question. The charges they brought were carefully crafted to tap into the fears and prejudices of their fellow citizens. First, they accused him of impiety, of not believing in the gods of Athens and introducing new deities. In a city where religious tradition provided social stability, this was serious. Second, they charged him with corrupting the youth of Athens, turning them against the values of their elders. These weren't random accusations. They were surgical strikes against Socrates' reputation, designed to paint him as both spiritually dangerous and socially destructive. But the real reason for the trial ran deeper than these formal charges. Athens was haunted by the ghosts of two men who had once sat at Socrates' feet, Alcibiades and Critias. Both had been brilliant students, both had absorbed their teachers' lessons about questioning everything, and both had become traitors to their city. Alcibiades, the golden boy of Athenian politics, had convinced the city to launch a disastrous military expedition to Sicily. When political enemies accused him of religious crimes, he fled to Sparta and helped Athens' enemies win crucial victories. The expedition he had championed ended in complete disaster. Thousands of Athenian soldiers dead, the city's treasury emptied, its naval power crippled. Critias was worse. When Sparta finally defeated Athens and installed a puppet government, he became one of the 30 tyrants who terrorized the city. Under his leadership, democratic leaders were executed, citizens were murdered for their property, and Athens lived under a reign of terror that made its defeat in war seem mild by comparison. How could the same teacher who preached virtue and wisdom have produced such monsters? This question gnawed at many Athenians. Maybe, they whispered, Socrates' teachings weren't as harmless as they seemed. Maybe all that questioning of authority and tradition had rotted his students' moral foundations. Maybe the old philosopher was more dangerous than anyone realized. The accusers knew they couldn't prove that Socrates directly ordered his students to betray Athens. But they didn't need to. They just needed to plant seeds of doubt. If his teaching methods could produce traitors, what did that say about the methods themselves? Meletus, a young poet whose work Socrates had probably criticized, represented the city's artistic community. Anytus, a wealthy leather merchant and democratic politician, spoke for those who saw Socrates as a threat to social stability. Lycon, a professional orator, embodied the intellectual establishment that had grown tired of being made to look foolish in public. Together, they crafted a narrative that was devastating in its simplicity. Socrates was a corrupter who used his intellectual gifts to undermine everything Athens held sacred. His questions weren't innocent curiosity. They were weapons designed to destroy faith in the gods, respect for tradition, and obedience to authority. The timing was perfect. Athens had just restored democracy after the nightmare of the 30 tyrants. Citizens were desperate for unity, for shared values, for leaders who would strengthen rather than question the social fabric. The last thing they wanted was more intellectual troublemaking from the man whose former students had brought such disaster upon their city. What made the charges even more dangerous was their partial truth. Socrates really didn't worship the gods in traditional ways. He really did encourage young people to question their elders. He really did believe that unexamined traditions were worthless. In a city trying to heal from trauma and betrayal, these truths felt like threats. But there was something the accusers hadn't counted on. Socrates had no intention of defending himself in the way they expected. He wouldn't beg for mercy, wouldn't promise to change his ways, wouldn't try to save his life by abandoning his principles. Instead, he would use his trial as the ultimate teaching moment, a final demonstration that some things matter more than survival. As the trial date approached, Athens buzzed with anticipation. Would the old philosopher finally be silenced? Or did he have one more surprise in store for the city that had grown tired of his questions? The day of the trial dawned clear and bright, but inside the courthouse, the atmosphere crackled with tension. 501 Athenian citizens had been selected by lot to serve as jurors, a number chosen specifically to prevent ties and make bribery nearly impossible. These weren't professional judges or legal experts. They were ordinary men, farmers and merchants, craftsmen and soldiers, citizens whose lives Socrates had touched in ways both profound and irritating. The water clock was set, and Miletus rose to present the prosecution's case. His speech was everything the crowd expected, passionate, patriotic, and designed to tap into every fear and prejudice harbored against the strange old man who had made questioning into an art form. But when Socrates stood to defend himself, something unprecedented happened. Instead of begging for mercy, he launched into what can only be described as the most provocative defense in legal history. Rather than trying to save his life, he used his allotted time to deliver a masterclass in philosophy that would be studied for millennia. "Men of Athens," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded courtroom, "I am not going to defend myself in the way you might expect. I will not bring my children before you weeping, nor will I employ the usual tricks of rhetoric to win your sympathy. Instead, I will tell you the truth, however unpleasant it might be." What followed was devastating in its honesty. Socrates systematically dismantled each charge while simultaneously challenging the very system that was trying him. Yes, he questioned traditional beliefs about the gods, but only to discover what true piety might be. Yes, he influenced young people, but to think for themselves, not to follow him blindly. Yes, he made people uncomfortable, but discomfort was often the first step toward wisdom. Then came the moment that sealed his fate. Instead of expressing remorse or promising to change his ways, Socrates compared himself to a gadfly sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse of Athens into action. "I am that gadfly which God has attached to the state," he declared, "and all day long and in all places am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you." The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a man on trial for his life, telling his judges that they needed him more than he needed them, that Athens, without his constant questioning, would fall into the sleep of complacency and ignorance, that killing him would be like swatting the gadfly. It might provide momentary relief, but it would ultimately harm the horse. He addressed the charges one by one with characteristic precision. On impiety, he pointed out the absurdity of claiming he didn't believe in gods while simultaneously accusing him of introducing new ones. On corrupting youth, he challenged anyone to produce a single young man he had actually led astray. His students' later actions, he argued, reflected their own choices, not his teaching. But perhaps most provocatively, he refused to accept the premise that his philosophical activities were crimes at all. "The unexamined life is not worth living," he declared. If questioning everything and admitting ignorance were crimes, then he was guilty as charged. But he would not apologize for dedicating his life to the pursuit of truth, even if that pursuit made others uncomfortable. As he spoke, the jurors grew increasingly restless. This wasn't how defendants were supposed to behave. They were supposed to grovel, to promise reform, to acknowledge the wisdom of their accusers. Instead, Socrates was lecturing them as if they were his students. He was treating his trial not as a legal proceeding, but as a philosophical dialogue where he remained the teacher and they were forced into the role of pupils. When the time came for the jury to vote, the margin was devastatingly narrow. 281 guilty, 220 not guilty. Just 31 votes had separated Socrates from acquittal. Had he shown even a hint of remorse or compromise, he would have walked free. But Socrates understood something his supporters didn't. Some principles are worth more than life itself. The slim margin of conviction revealed a city divided. Many Athenians recognized the value of what Socrates represented, even if they found him personally irritating. They understood that a society without questioners, without gadflies, without people willing to challenge conventional wisdom, was a society doomed to stagnation. But it wasn't enough. The fear of another Alcibiades, another Critias, another brilliant student turned traitor, outweighed their appreciation for intellectual courage. Athens had chosen safety over truth, comfort over growth, silence over questions. Yet Socrates wasn't finished. The trial would continue, and he still had one more lesson to teach. Athenian law provided an unusual second phase to trials involving potential death sentences. After a guilty verdict, both prosecution and defense could propose alternative punishments, and the jury would choose between them. This was meant to be an opportunity for mercy, a chance for defendants to show remorse and for juries to demonstrate compassion. Meletus and his co-prosecutors had demanded death. Now it was Socrates' turn to propose an alternative. Every person in that courtroom knew what they expected to hear: a plea for exile, an offer to pay a substantial fine, a promise to stop teaching philosophy, an expression of regret for past actions. Any of these might have swayed the jury toward leniency. Instead, Socrates delivered what may be the most audacious sentencing proposal in legal history. "What do I deserve to suffer or to pay?" he asked the jury. "What does a man deserve who has never led a quiet life but has neglected what occupies most people? Wealth, family interests, military appointments, speaking in the assembly, and all the other activities, plotting and associations that come up in our city?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Then, with the kind of logic that had made him both famous and infamous, he continued, "I thought I was too honest to survive if I went in for this sort of thing. So I did not go where I would be of no use either to you or to myself, but I went to each of you privately and conferred upon him what I say is the greatest benefit, by persuading him not to care for any of his belongings before caring that he himself should be as good and as wise as possible." The courtroom held its breath. Where was this leading? "What then do I deserve for being such a man? Something good, men of Athens, if I am to make the proposal according to my deserts, and something good that would be fitting for me. What then is fitting for a poor benefactor who needs leisure to exhort you? There is nothing more fitting for such a man than free meals in the Prytaneum." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Free meals in the Prytaneum, the highest honor Athens could bestow, reserved for Olympic victors and the city's greatest benefactors. This wasn't just defiance. It was a philosophical bomb thrown directly at the jury's conception of crime and punishment, guilt and merit. Socrates wasn't finished. With devastating logic, he explained why the usual punishments made no sense in his case. "Exile. If I am unable to persuade you, being a citizen, that I should not be banished, it is not likely that I shall persuade foreigners. Prison? Why should I live in prison, being a slave to the regularly appointed government? A fine? I have no money to pay a fine." But beneath the apparent arrogance lay a deeper principle. Socrates was demonstrating that he would not compromise his integrity even to save his life. If his philosophical activities were beneficial to Athens, and he genuinely believed they were, then punishing him for them would be unjust. Better to acknowledge their true value and reward him accordingly. The jury's reaction was predictable. They had offered him a chance to save himself, and he had used it to lecture them instead. The final vote was swift and decisive: death, by an even larger margin than his original conviction. Yet something profound had happened in that courtroom. Socrates had transformed his trial from a legal proceeding into a moral examination of Athens itself. He had forced his accusers and judges to confront fundamental questions about the nature of wisdom, the value of truth, and the proper relationship between the individual and the state. As the sentence was pronounced, Socrates remained calm. He had achieved something remarkable. He had maintained absolute consistency between his philosophy and his actions. The man who had spent his life teaching that virtue was more valuable than life had proven he meant it. "The hour of departure has arrived," he told the jury, "and we go our ways, I to die and you to live. Which is better God only knows." But Athens would soon discover the cost of silencing its gadfly. In choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable questions, in prioritizing order over truth, they had made a choice that would echo through history. They had killed the man, but they could not kill what he represented. The question now was whether that lesson would survive his death. 30 days passed between Socrates' sentencing and his execution, an unusual delay caused by a religious festival that prohibited executions while the sacred ship traveled to Delos. These 30 days would become the most philosophically rich period of Socrates' life, a final demonstration that his commitment to wisdom transcended even the fear of death. His friends were frantic. Crito, one of his oldest companions, arrived in prison with a carefully crafted escape plan. "We have bribed the guards," he whispered urgently. "A ship waits to take you to safety. You could live out your remaining years in comfort, continuing your philosophical work. Please, Socrates, don't throw your life away for the sake of stubborn principle." But Socrates saw the situation differently. "Tell me, Crito," he asked with characteristic gentleness, "if I escape, what lesson am I teaching? That laws should be obeyed only when convenient. That philosophical principles should be abandoned when they become costly. Would the Socrates who escaped from prison be the same man who spent 70 years arguing that virtue matters more than comfort?" This wasn't mere stubbornness. It was the logical conclusion of everything Socrates had taught. He had built his life on the premise that how we live matters more than how long we live, that integrity cannot be compromised without losing what makes us human, that some truths are worth dying for. His conversation with Crito revealed the depth of his thinking about law, morality, and civic duty. "I have lived my entire life as a citizen of Athens," he explained. "I was born here, educated here, married here, raised my children here. In choosing to remain, I entered into an implicit contract with the city's laws and institutions. That contract doesn't become void simply because those institutions have treated me unjustly. This wasn't passive acceptance of injustice." Socrates understood the difference between the failure of particular individuals and the failure of systems themselves. His judges had been wrong, but the principle of trial by jury remained sound. His accusers had been motivated by personal spite, but the right of citizens to bring charges remained important. The sentence was unjust, but the rule of law itself deserved respect. As word spread that Socrates was refusing to escape, something unexpected happened. People began to reconsider his trial, his teachings, and his character. The old man's willingness to die for his principles forced Athens to confront what they were about to lose. Young men who had dismissed him as an eccentric began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a human being living according to absolute moral consistency. His friends, initially frustrated by his refusal to flee, gradually recognized that escape would have made Socrates into something he had never been, a hypocrite who abandoned his principles when they became inconvenient. On his final day, Socrates spent hours discussing the nature of death and the immortality of the soul with his disciples. Far from being morbid, these conversations were filled with intellectual excitement as he explored the ultimate philosophical question. "No one knows whether death may not be the greatest of all blessings for man," he mused. "Yet people fear it as if they knew quite well that it is the greatest of evils." When the time came, the prison guard who brought the cup of hemlock was weeping. "Socrates," he said, "I know you are the noblest, gentlest, and best man who has ever been brought here. Please don't think I'm responsible for your death. You know who the real culprits are." Socrates comforted the man who was about to execute him. "Don't worry, my friend. I know you're only doing your duty." Then, with characteristic curiosity, he asked about the proper way to take the poison, approaching even his own death as a learning opportunity. His last words were puzzling. "Crito, I owe a rooster to Asclepius. Will you remember to pay the debt?" Some scholars believe this was a final philosophical statement, that Socrates saw death as a cure for the disease of life and was thanking the god of healing for his recovery. As the hemlock took effect, Socrates remained calm, continuing to speak with his friends until his voice grew weak. His last coherent act was to uncover his face and remind Crito about the debt to Asclepius. Then the greatest questioner in human history fell silent forever. But his silence would prove more powerful than his voice had ever been. Athens had succeeded in executing Socrates, but they had failed utterly in their attempt to silence what he represented. Within hours of his death, the transformation began. The city that had killed its gadfly would soon discover that some ideas become immortal precisely because someone was willing to die for them. Socrates' questions would outlive every person who had condemned him, and his death would become the foundation upon which Western philosophy would be built. Athens thought they were ending a story. Instead, they had written its most important chapter. As the sun set on that spring day in 399 BC, Athens believed it had solved a problem. The troublesome old man who had spent decades making respected citizens look foolish was finally silenced. The youth would no longer be corrupted by dangerous questions. Social order would be restored. Democracy would be safe from those who questioned everything. They could not have been more wrong. Within months of Socrates' execution, something extraordinary began to happen. The story of his trial and death spread throughout the Greek world, carried by his students and friends who had witnessed his final demonstration of philosophical courage. But it wasn't just the facts that spread. It was the questions his death raised about the nature of wisdom, justice, and the proper relationship between the individual and society. Plato, his most famous student, was transformed by his teacher's death. The young aristocrat who might have pursued a career in politics instead dedicated his life to preserving and extending Socratic philosophy. His dialogues didn't just record what Socrates taught, they showed how he taught, using the very method of questioning that had gotten him killed to explore the deepest mysteries of human existence. But the true measure of Socrates' victory wasn't in the books that would be written about him. It was in the principle he had died defending, that some truths matter more than life itself, that intellectual courage is a form of moral courage, that a society afraid of questions is a society afraid of growth. The Athens that killed Socrates would eventually fade from history. The Spartan system that defeated them would crumble. The accusations made against him would be forgotten. But the questions he asked, what is justice? What is virtue? How should we live? These would echo through every generation, challenging each new age to examine its own assumptions and comfortable certainties. The irony was perfect and devastating. Athens had tried to preserve its stability by silencing its greatest questioner. Instead, they had created the most powerful symbol of intellectual freedom in human history. The city that feared his influence during his lifetime would become immortal precisely because they had been home to his philosophy. Today, over 2 millennia later, we still grapple with the same tension that destroyed Socrates. How much questioning should a society tolerate? When do challenges to authority become threats to order? How do we balance the need for stability with the necessity of growth? These questions matter because they're not just philosophical abstractions, they're lived as realities. Every time someone challenges conventional wisdom, questions authority, or refuses to accept comfortable lies, they walk in the footsteps of Socrates. Every time a society chooses to silence rather than engage with uncomfortable questions, they repeat Athens' mistake. The trial of Socrates teaches us that the real danger isn't in the questions themselves, but in our fear of them. A society confident in its values can afford to examine them. A democracy secure in its foundations can tolerate dissent. It's only when we become afraid of what questions might reveal that we risk destroying the very thing we're trying to protect. Socrates understood this. His final gift to Athens, and to us, Wasn't his answers, but his questions. Not his certainty, but his doubt. Not his life, but his willingness to give it up for the principle that the unexamined life is not worth living. Athens silenced Socrates, but they could not silence what he represented. His questions survived his execution, outlived his executioners, and continue to challenge us today. In the end, the teacher who claimed to know nothing taught the most important lesson of all: that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to do what's right despite that fear. The gadfly of Athens was dead, but his sting would be felt forever. And perhaps that's exactly what he intended all along. Jury, YouTube description. When Athens sentenced its greatest mind to death, the trial that changed philosophy forever. In 399 BC, the world's first democracy put its greatest philosopher on trial. Socrates, the man who taught us to question everything, faced charges of corrupting youth and impiety. But this wasn't really about his alleged crimes. It was about something far more dangerous: his relentless pursuit of truth in a society that preferred comfortable lies. This is the story of how Athens chose to silence the questions that made them uncomfortable, not realizing they were creating the most powerful symbol of intellectual courage in human history. Key moments. 000, the dangerous question. 430, the accusation. 915, the fatal defense. 14 Dwaus, the choice between wisdom and survival. 1830, the immortal legacy. What you'll discover. Why Socrates' former students became traitors to Athens. The shocking defense that sealed his fate. How his refusal to escape revealed his deepest principles. Why his death transformed him from local troublemaker to eternal symbol. The timeless lesson about intellectual courage versus social conformity. Socrates proved that some ideas become immortal precisely because someone was willing to die for them. His questions outlived every person who condemned him, and his trial remains the ultimate examination of the eternal conflict between truth and power. What questions are you afraid to ask? What comfortable certainties might crumble under examination? The gadfly of Athens died, but his sting lives on. Are you ready to feel it? Philosophy, Socrates, ancient Greece, Athens, intellectual courage, Western philosophy, trial, democracy, truth, questions, wisdom, Plato, classical philosophy, moral courage, free speech,